And I think anytime you have Pepper Bryars on the phone lines with us, it's going to be exciting. Pepper, welcome into the conversation. How are you doing?
Doing well, as always. It is a pleasure to be with you.
It's good to talk to you, Pepper. So the article I want to break down with you today really focuses around the $1.3 trillion spending bill that was passed and a very big subject that was in it that most people have brushed off now. And as a conservative, Pepper, you wrote about the $400 million to Planned Parenthood, and break down that article a little bit for us, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty after that.
Sure. There's a fundamental thing you must do before delving into this, and that is that those of us who are pro-life must ask ourselves this question. Do we truly believe abortion is what we say it is, which is the butchering of an innocent, defenseless, unborn person? Now, if the answer to that question is yes, then here's the second question that we must ask ourselves. What other issue is more important than stopping that from happening? Is tax cuts more important than stopping that? Is a border wall or getting a border wall started, is that more important than stopping unborn children from being murdered? Is funding for this project or that project that might even directly contribute to you or your community, is that more important than stopping unborn children from being murdered? Because if it is the most important issue, and I personally believe it's the most important issue of our lifetime, then our political leaders and our movement in general has failed us, because it is not only continuing to happen, we are continuing to collect money from the taxpayers to pay for it. And it's worse than that, because we're actually borrowing money to pay for it. So we're borrowing money that our children and our grandchildren are going to have to pay back to continue this awful practice. And it just stung me a few weeks ago when they passed that $1.3 trillion spending bill, because as the editor of Yellowhammer News, I get a lot of news releases, and I watch tweets from our political leaders, and I love them. Listen, I love all of our conservative Republicans from Alabama, but I got a lot of emails from them saying, okay, we got funding for this in Huntsville, we got funding for that in Birmingham, and we're doing this, we're doing this thing, we're doing that thing, and it's all great and good. But it kind of got me thinking, yes, but you're spending $400 million and sending it to Planned Parenthood after all of y'all promised. You pledged that if we would put you in charge in Congress and if we would put you in charge in the White House, that would stop. And it hasn't.
So, Pepper, just kind of playing the devil's advocate here, what about if I say, well, they had to pass that bill so the government wouldn't shut down?
Listen, when the government does that, it's only a partial shutdown, but that's beside the point. Again, back to the question I asked at the beginning. What's the most important thing to you? Is if we believe abortion is what we say it is, and that's the murder of unborn children, and it's happening at the rate of thousands, tens of thousands a year in our country, then are we just going to let that happen at the expense of, quote, keeping the government open? Now, see, the other side wins on this every time, because their leaders are willing to, and their advocates and activists are willing to go to the mat because they believe in it. They believe in abortion on demand. They don't believe it's a life, and even if they do, they don't believe it's sentient life. And even if they believe it's sentient life, they believe that a woman or a doctor or whoever should be able to determine who lives and who doesn't live based on the value and quality of their life. They're willing to fight for it. Now, what I'm trying to ask people is, do you believe differently than they do? Well, if you do, then you got to fight for it, because it's not going to change if you're just going to sit back and let other priorities come along and decide what you do every day. And, like I said in that piece, compromise is generally desirable. If you look at our Constitution, it was made to put gridlock into our political system. were a diverse republic back then when they put the Constitution in place. We're an even more diverse republic now. You need consensus to be able to push things through. It's generally good because you don't want one side dictating what everybody must do. So I'm generally in favor of consensus and compromise on a lot of issues, but not all the time. I mean, going back 130 years ago, where was the compromise on slavery? How do you compromise that? Maybe slavery until they're a certain age and then let them go, or look at women's suffrage. Where do you compromise on allowing a woman the right to vote? Well, maybe if she's married, or maybe wait until she reaches 45. No, there's no compromise in those things, because at root, slavery and denying women the right to vote were wrong from A to Z. Okay, abortion is wrong from A to Z. There's no doubt about it. Science is on our side. It's biology. It's not theology. And we need to press this, and we need to hold our leaders, our movement, and especially ourselves accountable for our beliefs and what is happening in our country and in our state. Now, I need to remind you, some of your, most of your listeners there in Birmingham, there's a Planned Parenthood abortuary in Birmingham. Okay, there's one down in Mobile too, and Planned Parenthood just got $400 million from the taxpayers to do what it is that they do. And I think that's awful.
You also go on in your article to describe a kind of a gruesome description of what happens to babies about being aborted in the womb. Pepper, do you think if that was more known, how the process is, do you think that would get this issue more traction?
Yes, I do. Let me call to mind an image that you've probably seen. It was from the antebellum South during slavery. There was a slave. He looks to be in his 40s or 50s, and the picture is of his back, and it is just scarred up and down from whipping. Do you recall that picture? It's pretty famous for historical reasons. You could not get away from the image of slavery.
Yeah,
it confronted you.
Yeah,
you couldn't escape it. And we hide the fact of what happens to these innocent, defenseless children. And I don't mean to shock. I don't mean to sound so aggressive on this, but again, ask yourself, do you believe what's going on? And if you don't quite understand, if you think, the descriptions of what happens in abortion, like, a needle piercing an unborn child's heart and injecting poison in it to stop it from beating, and then limbs being snipped off and pulled apart. If you think that's all just, a talk to gin people up, then I would encourage people to go and read about it. And don't use pro-life sources. Go and read pro-choice sources. They'll tell you what happens. This is not mysterious to anybody who wants to spend 30 minutes to an hour to do the research. It hurts. It can make your heart callous if you spend too much time reading about it. That's why you have to back up, and you have to take a breath, and then you have to say, oh my gosh, this is happening. What are we going to do about it? And then you direct that sadness to justifiable outrage and say, why are we, okay, if we can't outlaw it, then, for the love of God, let's not fund it. Let's not make people pay for this.
Pepper Bryars joining us on the Ford Faction right now. Pepper, now, I read in your article you said that Congressman Mo Brooks of Huntsville and Gary Palmer of Birmingham voted against the massive spending bill, and you also mentioned good for them. But when you have guys like Richard Shelby and Bradley Byrne of Mobile and Martha Roby of Montgomery, why can't it seem like we can get really our politicians to come together on such a topic like this?
Yeah, and Robert Adderholt as well. I mean, and look, all of those guys are great conservatives. I didn't mean to single them out to say, oh, they did a bad thing. This is how things work in Congress now, where you have these giant bills, and they don't do it through regular order, and they come up with this big, huge bill, and they say, hey, 90% of this thing is good, 10% of it is awful. We're going to shut down the government. You're going to lose all these things. So then it's hard to be a voting politician where you actually have to either say yes or no to things. So I understand why they voted for it. It was all rational and justifiable. What I'm asking everybody to do is kind of back up for a second and take stock of what we truly believe. And I would say to them, look, if you vote against, because this is going to come up again in a few months. That was only a temporary spending bill. We're going to go through this whole situation in a few more months. And I would hope that they look at it and say, when President Trump signed the bill, he said, never again. He said, I'm going to sign this one, and then that's it. We're going to have to make some changes. I pray that he follows through with that. And I pray that our congressional delegation says the same thing. Okay, never again. All right, we got our hands dirty with this one. We pushed it through, but that's it. Basta. It ends.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting how he said, this is the last one. I'm never going to do this again. Then proceeded to sign it, and we can only now hope and pray that he does not do that again, that he actually holds the Senate and Congress accountable.
Yeah, he said something in there that in that same tweet that worried me. He said he wanted the line item veto, which is where a president can look at a bill and just actually line out some things and pass it. So he would go in and line out possibly Planned Parenthood funding and all that. That's a pipe dream. It's never going to happen. You have to have a constitutional amendment for that, and it basically gives the power of the purse, which is Congress's only real power, annually, gives it to the president. So that's not going to happen. So I hope he wasn't saying, I will never do this again if you give me the line item veto.
Yeah. I'm
hoping he was just saying, I'm never going to do it again. But I would say to our political leaders, hey, if you say, hey, I love everything else in this bill, but it's got Planned Parenthood funding in it, I'm not voting for it. No matter what they throw at you, say, well, you're denying funding for this project in Huntsville and for that project in Birmingham. I'm hoping they say, yeah, that's all well and good, but we made a promise. This is a huge issue, and we're done.
Yeah.
I hope they'll understand that they'd be speaking for their people. That's what we want. We have to end that.
Yeah. And stick to their guns. That actually got them elected. Pepper Bryars joining us on the Ford Faction. Pepper, thanks so much for stopping by and breaking this down with us.
Thank you so much. Talk to you next week.
Well, yeah, we'll talk to you next week, 12:30. Pepper Bryars, editor of YellowhammerNews.com. That audio will be up on there later along with his article. You can go find it there on YellowhammerNews.com. Alabama conservatives must make ending abortion our top priority. This is the Ford Faction. We'll be right back.